The grand chamber of the Council of 8,000 Stars was a hollowed-out moon, its curved walls draped in the banners of 600 member species. At its center, standing alone on a polished disk of compressed neutronium, Ambassador Dorian Voss refused to lower his gaze. High Arbiter Joreth perched above him, a slender being of pale gray cartilage and rotating cranial plates, each eye a separate sensor cluster that shifted independently. The other delegates, arthropods, liquid breathers, sentient gas clouds held in containment fields, and cold-world intellects encased in crystal carapaces, watched in a silence that hummed with subsonic translation feeds. Ambassador Voss, Joreth's voice came through bone conduction, a courtesy for the human's auditory range. The Council acknowledges your species' distress. However, the withering consumes everything it touches. We cannot afford to commit the combined fleets to defend a single biosphere. You're not being asked to save one world, Voss said, his voice level. You're being asked to honor the Mutual Defense Clause. Earth is a signatory. We have bled in 3 border conflicts for this body. The withering has already erased the Threnny sovereignty. It will come for you next. A rustle of sub-vocalized dissent rippled through the chamber. The representative from the Pact of Chitinous Spires, a tall, segmented being whose name translated as 12-fold burden, clicked its mandibles. If we reroute the containment buoys, we can nudge the anomaly's trajectory, divert it entirely into the human arm. The cost would be 6 fringe colonies and 1 primary world, acceptable statistical outcome. Voss's jaw tightened. You're talking about sacrificing my entire species as a speed bump. Joreth's cranial plates fluttered. We are talking about ensuring the survival of 600 civilizations. A motion has been seconded. We will vote. The human ambassador's hand went to the diplomatic implant behind his ear, but the link to Earth was already being throttled. The screen above the dais flickered. Earth's last open channel, a wide-angle view of the homeworld's curve of blue and white, with the dirty smudge of the withering sliding into the frame. The voting tally raced. Species after species cast their approval. 12-fold burden's vote registered. The gaseous intelligences pulsed green. Even the Threnny remnant, a refugee AI, voted yes, thankful to redirect the horror elsewhere. Voss took a single step forward. 2 council peacekeepers, massive quadrupedal figures with static-laden stun rods, closed in. He did not resist. He kept his eyes locked on the screen as the Earthlink began to fragment. You're condemning 10 billion people, he said, not shouting. You're also making the biggest mistake in galactic history. Joreth's tone held a note that might have been regret on a mammal. History remembers sacrifices, Ambassador. It rarely remembers the sacrificed. Take him into custody. As the stun rods touched his spine and his muscles locked, Voss watched Earth's image dissolve into static. The withering, a churning, colorless mass that drank light and logic, had made contact with the outer defense grid. One by one, the orbital platforms winked out. Then the feed died. The last thing he saw was not fire, but a spreading gray silence, as if the universe itself had decided that humanity was a story it would stop telling. He would spend 12 years in a cell beneath the Council's moon, with that image burned into his memory, and he would spend every day of those 12 years waiting. The prison cell was a bubble of transparent alloy suspended in a zero-gravity maintenance shaft. Dorian Voss had long since stopped measuring time by the guard rotations. He measured it by the slow whitening of his hair and the calluses on his knuckles from the resistance exercises he performed against the curved wall. The Council never executed him. A dead martyr was a symbol. A living, forgotten prisoner was a footnote. Occasionally, a junior delegate would visit, trying to understand human emotional architecture for academic purposes. Voss would answer questions with quiet, unnerving precision, never once begging for release. That disturbed them more than rage would have. On the outside, the galaxy moved on. The withering had stalled after consuming the Sol system. its advance inexplicably halted at the border of the Orion Spur. The Council's best minds theorized that the anomaly had finally gorged itself on a large enough biosphere and entered a dormant phase. Relief became routine. The sacrificial strategy was recast as a masterstroke. Humanity's extinction was no longer a tragedy, but a case study in strategic necessity, taught to young diplomats across 80 federations. Then, 12 standard years after the verdict, the listening posts at the edge of the dead zone began to scream. Voss was in the middle of a conversation, if it could be called that, with a young xenopologist from a silicon-based species when the corridor lights shifted to emergency amber. The prisoner pod shuddered as distant shockwaves rippled through the moon's superstructure. A subsonic alarm vibrated through the alloy. The xenopologist's crystalline fronds shivered and went rigid. "What's happening?" Voss asked, his voice carefully calm. The young scholar's translation bead sputtered. "A signal, an ident code, the archives are matching it. It cannot be." Voss waited. He had learned patience in a way that frightened his captors. The security feed on the cell's single display came alive, overriding the standard incarceration protocols. A council intelligence officer, a flat, mantle-like being with phosphorescent veins, appeared, visibly trembling. Behind it, tactical screens showed a fleet emerging from a region of space that should have been a graveyard. The silhouettes multiplied, hundreds, then thousands, then a number the tactical system struggled to bracket. The signal being broadcast from the lead ship was a simple audio file, repeated on every known council frequency. Voss heard it for the first time in over a decade, and the sound of a human voice speaking Gal Standard with a cold, deliberate cadence filled his cell. "This is the Terran Armada. The Sol system has responded to the Council's call for sacrifice. We are coming to collect the debt. All Council leadership will convene. No vessels are to interfere. This is your only advisory." The message ended. The intelligence officer's phosphorescence flickered in a pattern Voss had come to recognize as existential terror. High Arbiter Joreth's voice cut through the command channel, strained but still authoritative. "Seal the prisoner's pod, increase the guard detail, and someone contact the human fleet, find out what they are." Voss leaned his head back against the cool wall of his cell, and the corners of his mouth lifted. It was not a grin of triumph. It was the expression of a man who had been holding his breath for over a decade and finally, could exhale. He spoke softly, to the empty cell, to the ghost of a world. "Took you long enough." Terran Armada did not arrive through conventional wormhole translation. The ships peeled out of the void like wounds opening in stretched canvas, ripping into council space with a silence that felt far more threatening than any explosion. Their hulls were unrecognizable, no sleek silver or industrial gray, but a matte, shifting surface of semi-organic material that moved like living carbon, absorbing and reflecting light in irregular pulses. The ships themselves were a jagged fusion of human engineering and something profoundly alien, as if they had grown their weapons rather than mounted them. At the heart of the fleet, the dreadnought Unbowed dwarfed the Council's largest orbital defense platforms. Its forward section bore a massive emblem, a stylized earth encircled not by olive branches, but by a serpent that consumed its own tail, a symbol of eternity and hunger. Admiral Mara Kine stood on the command deck, her hands loosely clasped behind her back. She was tall, with close-cropped dark hair and a face that carried the same patient, worn expression Voss had perfected. Her uniform was functional black, devoid of medals. She didn't need them. The crew around her moved with the fluid, silent precision of people who had long since passed through the worst horrors and found something sharp on the other side. "Council Space Control is hailing us," her communications officer reported. "They're demanding our full credentials and a formal declaration of intent." "Send them the same message we broadcast," Kine said. "Then go silent. No further hails until they assemble their leaders." The fleet did not fire a single shot. It didn't need to. Instead, Kine gave the order for a calibrated demonstration. The Armada's dreadwave emitter, reverse-engineered from the Withering's own psychic shock front, activated. For exactly 4 seconds, every sentient being on the capital world below experienced a complete collapse of emotional certainty. It was not pain. It was a staggering, hollow dread, a forced awareness of their own mortality, followed by a flood of raw, unfiltered human grief. The feeling of losing everything, processed by 10 billion souls, compressed into a single broadcast. It left millions weeping on their floors without knowing why. Then it stopped. In the prison cell, the guard detail collapsed. Voss, unaffected due to his isolation, watched his restraints deactivate as the emergency systems glitched. The door opened. Minutes later, a human strike team found him. They were armored in that same half-living material, their helmets retracting to reveal tired, fierce faces. One of them, a sergeant with a burned scar across her jaw, helped him to his feet. "Ambassador Voss," she said, "Admiral Kine sent us. We're bringing you home." Voss steadied himself. "Home is gone." "No, sir," the sergeant replied quietly. "Earth held. It's not the same, but it held. We'll brief you aboard." He was escorted to the Unbowed through a shuttle flight that showed him the true scale of the fleet. Thousands of ships, many of them retrofitted civilian haulers, research vessels, even generation arcs, all bristling with terrifying weaponry. The Armada was not just a military force. It was a civilization that had clawed its way back from the brink. When Voss stepped onto the bridge, Mara Kine turned to face him. She nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. "Mr. Ambassador, you've been waiting a long time for this. The Council's leadership is assembling. They're scared beyond reason, which means they're dangerous. You know them better than anyone. Tell me what to expect." Voss looked at the holographic display of the capital world, the council chamber where he had been condemned, now ringed by human warships. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They will offer apologies and justifications. They will try to frame our survival as a proof that their plan worked, that we became stronger through sacrifice. Then they will offer us a seat at the table as if nothing happened." Kine's expression did not change. "And what should we give them?" "The truth," Voss said, "all of it, and then an ultimatum." The dreadnought's engines resonated with a low, thrumming note. The Armada began its slow, deliberate descent into the Council's defensive perimeter, daring anyone to fire. No one did. The Grand Chamber had not changed. The same banners, the same polished neutronium disk, the same raised dais where Joreth now trembled visibly. But this time the chamber was not sealed. The ceiling had been opened, literally peeled back by precision-cutting beams, to reveal the belly of the Unbowed hovering overhead, a massive sword of Damocles against the starfield. Dorian Voss walked onto the central disk, his footsteps echoing. He wore no armor, no weapon, just a simple dark tunic. Behind him, Admiral Kine stood with 6 armored guards who were not there to protect the ambassador. They were there to witness. Every species was present, but now they were silent not from protocol, but from cold dread. 12-fold burden had retracted its mandibles and stood motionless. The gas intelligences had condensed their forms into tight, defensive spheres. Even the Threnny remnant AI had dimmed its interface lights, as if trying to appear non-threatening. Voss activated a hollow emitter set into the disk. It projected a perfect recreation of the council session 12 years ago. His own pleas, the vote, the moment Earth's feed died. The recording played in full, with all the damning metadata that proved no manipulation. The chamber's translation systems rendered it for every species. When it finished, Joreth spoke, his cranial plates flaring defensively. "Ambassador Voss, we acknowledge that this council made a decision that appears cruel in hindsight, but the withering was stalled. The sacrifice saved hundreds of worlds. You are here, alive, stronger than before. Does that not validate our actions? You cannot condemn necessity." Voss looked up at the Arbiter, and there was no rage in his eyes, only a sadness so deep it seemed to pull the air from the room. "You still don't understand what you did. Tell them, Admiral." Kyne stepped forward, her voice carrying with the practiced clarity of a ship commander. The withering was not a natural anomaly. It was a weapon system, created by a precursor civilization you call the architects of the last veil. It was designed to consume sapient life and convert its neural energy into a seed form that would awaken a much larger, dormant extinction mechanism. By redirecting it toward Earth, you fed it a planet of 10 billion highly connected, fiercely imaginative minds. You nearly completed the activation sequence. She let that sink in. We stopped it. We didn't just survive. We fought it from inside in the neural spaces between what it consumes and what it leaves behind. Our telepaths, our engineers, our dreamers, they became the firewall. It cost us. Over 2 billion were lost in the integration. But we learned to harness the withering substrate. The technology you see in this Armada is a domesticated extension of that very weapon. We carry the thing that should have killed us, and we have turned it into our shield. A sound like a collective exhalation swept through the chamber. 12-fold Burden's mandibles clattered in a species-specific expression of horror. A liquid breather's tank began to bubble erratically. "You awakened a precursor failsafe," Voss said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through everything. "And we had to become something terrifying to shut it down, so do not speak to me of necessity." Jareth's cranial plates went still. "What do you demand?" Admiral Kyne raised a hand, and the unbowed's underbelly opened a single launch bay. A containment pod drifted down, housing a pulsating piece of dormant, withering tissue. "The Council's current structure is a failure. It sacrifices the vulnerable for the comfort of the powerful. Effective immediately, all military fleets will stand down and undergo joint oversight with human command. The Council will be reconstituted as a compact of shared survival, with binding obligations and a veto held by Earth. We are not asking." A new voice cut in, a delegate from the Sithra, a reclusive insectoid species draped in black silk. "And if we refuse, you would slaughter billions. That makes you no different from the withering." Kyne's eyes met the delegate's compound gaze. "We won't slaughter. We will simply leave. And we will take with us the only force in the galaxy that understands how to stop the precursors if they ever return. You'll be free to fend for yourselves." The silence that followed was heavier than any dreadwave. It was the silence of a room full of species realizing that their survival had just changed hands. Then the Sithra delegate did something unexpected. It emitted a low, vibrating hum that translated as a species-wide alert. The ground beneath the capital city began to tremble. From a hidden installation deep underground, a column of null light erupted upward, splitting the sky. A dimensional tear, the very signature of the architects of the last veil, began to rip reality open above the capital. "You should not have come here," the Sithra delegate hissed. "The architects left us guardians of their final door. If you want to wield the withering, then meet its master." The tear widened, and something ancient and infinitely patient began to pull itself through. The dimensional tear was not black, nor glowing. It was a wound of pure absence, a bleeding hole in causality that made optical sensors fail and sent organics stumbling back, clutching their heads. The Sithra delegate's form began to unravel, its silk robes billowing as it was drawn upward toward the rift. The species had clearly never intended to survive their trump card. In orbit, 3 fleets loyal to the old Council military, the Chiton Spire Armada, the Carrick Interdictors, and a swarm of automated Threnny remnant drones, chose that moment to attack the human ships. They had apparently believed the Dreadwave was a bluff, that the Terran Armada could be broken by sheer volume of fire. Admiral Kyne did not flinch. "Commence defensive phalanx pattern full integration. Unshackle the bonded cores." The human ships responded with a precision that was beautiful in its lethality. Their semi-organic hulls slewed off a layer of inert matter, revealing glowing, vein-like conduits that pulsed with a soft gray light, the domesticated withering substrate. When the enemy volley struck, the energy was not blocked by shields. It was drunk. The ships absorbed the incoming fire, metabolized it, and used it to strengthen their own arrays. Then the human counterstrike came. Disruptor beams lanced out, not to destroy, but to unspool. The Chiton Spire flagship's hull plating unraveled at the atomic level, its metals sighing into a fine dust that drifted away like sand. The Carrack interdictors experienced a sudden and complete loss of life support, their systems whispered into hibernation by a withering-derived logic phage that ignored hardware and directly edited the software of their AI cores. The Threnny drones simply halted, their networked minds flooded with a single, devastating human emotion: compassion for a species that had been misled, overridden by a deep, sorrowful plea to stand down. Most of the drones immediately reversed course. The entire engagement lasted 17 minutes. Not a single human ship was lost. Not a single life was taken aboard the crippled vessels. The withering phage was surgically precise, incapacitating without killing. The Council's military leadership, watching from groundside bunkers, surrendered unconditionally. But the tier continued to widen. From the rift emerged a shape that was not a ship, not a creature, but a conceptual predator, a lattice of frozen possibility, a geometry of pure elimination. The architect's failsafe, the entity the withering had been designed to feed, was finally awake. It had no name. It simply unmade things. Kyne's tactical officer reported, "The entity is unspooling the orbital perimeter. Our dreadwave has no effect. Conventional weapons are being absorbed into the rift before they can impact." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "Get me the liaison now." A side hatch opened, and a woman walked onto the bridge. She wore a simple civilian jumpsuit, her hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes carrying a distant, haunted light. Myra Okonkwo had been one of the first volunteer interface pilots during the Withering War. She had spent 8 years inside a semi-conscious neural bond with a dormant Withering core seed. She was more than a pilot. She was a living bridge between human will and the architect's technology. Okonkwo looked at the tier through the viewscreen. "It's the same pattern we saw in the integration deepscape. That's the anchor point. The architects built these rifts as doorways for their overseer constructs. The Sithra must have been the caretakers, worshipping it, waiting for a reason to open the door." "Can you close it?" Kyne asked, though she already dreaded the answer. Okonkwo's voice was soft. "Yes, but the rift is stabilized by a consciousness-null anchor. Someone has to go in and bind it from within, become the new anchor of negation, hold the pattern long enough for the tier to suture shut. Once inside, there's no retrieval. The anchor unravels." A heavy silence fell. Ambassador Voss stepped forward. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Okonkwo said. She turned to the Admiral. "My core seed is already half attuned to this frequency. I'm the only one who can do it and guarantee success. You brought me here for a reason." Kyne's face was a mask of command, but the skin around her eyes tightened. "Myra, we didn't claw our way back from extinction to sacrifice our best." Okonkwo gave a small, sad smile. "We clawed our way back so that we'd have something worth protecting. That's the whole point. Please, Admiral, let me do this." Outside, the conceptual predator was taking notice of the unbowed. Voss watched the young woman he had only just met, and he saw in her the same fire that had kept him alive in a prison cell for 12 years. Not fury, not vengeance. A stubborn, defiant love for everything humanity had been and everything it could be. "Record her words," Voss said quietly. "Every syllable. The galaxy will remember." Myra Okonkwo's transfer shuttle was a bare cargo skiff, stripped of any weaponry to avoid provoking the rift's defensive logic. The Armada held a protective formation around the capital world, but every ship had silenced its engines, their crews watching the tiny blip on their screens. The conceptual predator did not attack the skiff. It seemed curious, its lattice of frozen possibility tilting as Okonkwo transmitted a harmonic counterfrequency derived from her withering bond, a lullaby of inverted architect math. The tear's bleeding wound flickered, its edges momentarily stabilizing. Inside the shuttle, Okonkwo closed her eyes and engaged the deep link that threaded her mind to the core seed embedded in her sternum. The seed, a harmless-looking gray pebble fused with her flesh, began to glow with a soft inner light. To her, the universe unfolded as a sheet of vibrating strings, and the tear was a knot that needed to be held still while the surrounding threads wove themselves back together. She broadcast a final message to the unbowed. Her voice was steady, but the deep link carried the full emotional weight behind each word. Admiral Kine, Ambassador Voss. The architects built this thing to be final, but they made a mistake. They assumed that the anchor would always be a mindless sacrificial input. I'm going in with everything I am, every memory, every hope, every stupid song my grandmother taught me. That's not negation. That's a pattern too complex for the rift to unspool quickly. It'll buy you the closure window. Tell my parents I love them. Tell Earth that she's beautiful. Before anyone could respond, the shuttle's hatch opened, and Okonkwo stepped directly into the void, no suit, no tether. The rift's edge embraced her, and she dissolved, not into nothingness but into a scatter of silver light that spread across the tear's circumference. The effect was immediate. The tear stopped expanding. The predator construct emitted a soundless scream that manifested as a shockwave of displaced probability, throwing several human destroyers out of alignment. But the edges of the rift began to draw together, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, as if a seamstress were pulling a wound shut with needles made of starlight. On the unbowed's bridge, the main viewer showed a visual that no one would forget. The silver light of Okonkwo's consciousness formed a scaffolding inside the tear, ghost-like, unmistakably human in shape, arms outstretched. For a few heartbeats, the face of the woman who had volunteered was visible on that scaffold, eyes closed in concentration. Then the tear collapsed to a single point of compressed energy and vanished. The capital sky was whole again. The predator was gone. The Sithra's hidden installation crumbled into a sinkhole, its ancient purpose spent. The Armada's sensors confirmed zero residual tachyon leakage. The rift was permanently sealed. Admiral Kine stood motionless for a long moment, her crew silent around her. Then she spoke, her voice rough as gravel. "Log the time, mark the coordinates. She gets a star named after her. I don't care what the old Naming charters say, she gets a star." Ambassador Voss, who had seen so much loss and held it inside for over a decade, finally felt his eyes sting. He let the tears fall. It was the most human thing he could do, and he refused to be ashamed. The Sithra delegate, or what remained of its tattered consciousness broadcast from a dying relay, sent a final fragmented query. Why would one of you unmake yourself for us? We tried to destroy you." Kine herself answered, transmitting on an open channel. "Because that's what humanity does when it's at its best. We fill the gaps. We hold the line. Not because we're forced to, but because someone has to, and we refuse to let the next species be sacrificed the way ours was. That's the difference between us and the architects." In the silence that followed, the Armada began a slow, respectful withdrawal from immediate orbit, giving the capital world room to breathe. But the human ships did not leave the system. They remained, a permanent sentinel presence, their crews somber but unbroken. The Council of 8,000 Stars was not abolished. It was refounded. In the weeks following the sealing of the dimensional tier, every member species was required to ratify the Compact of Shared Survival, a document drafted jointly by Voss, Kine, and a delegation of reformed council representatives. The new accord banned the practice of sacrificial deflection, established emergency mutual defense protocols, and placed a human-led monitoring fleet in permanent station above the capital. It was not occupation. It was an insurance policy against fear's ability to corrupt governance. Ambassador Dorian Voss, after 12 years in a cell and a lifetime of service, was elected the first High Steward of the Compact. He accepted with a heavy heart, knowing that his true home was still a wounded Earth, but understanding that his duty now lay in stitching the galaxy together. His first official act was to commission the Okonkwo Memorial Array, a constellation of small satellites that orbited the capital star, each one bearing a fragment of the volunteers' recorded message, translated into every known language. Admiral Mara Kine refused a political position. She returned to the Unbowed and took the Armada on a long patrol of the Orion Spur's outer rim, mapping the residual architect installations that the Sithra's betrayal had hinted at. The precursors were not gone. They were merely sleeping, and humanity intended to be ready. The homeworld, when Voss finally visited it, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The withering had scoured vast tracts of land to gray nothingness, but from that nothingness, new ecosystems had emerged, strange, resilient flora that fed on the lingering substrate, oceans that now shimmered with a faint auroral light. Cities had been rebuilt not as gleaming spires but as living, breathing communes embedded into the healed landscape. Earth had not just survived, it had transformed. Voss stood on a cliff, overlooking the reborn Pacific, the wind tugging at his coat. Beside him, a young aide, born after the withering war, who had never known a pre-sacrifice world, asked him what he was thinking. "I'm thinking about the stories we'll tell," Voss said. "About the council that tried to erase us, and the people who refused to be erased. But mostly I'm thinking about Myra Okonkwo and how she didn't die for vengeance. She died to prove that fear doesn't get the final word." The aide was silent, and Voss let the moment stretch. In the distance, a transport shuttle lifted off, carrying a delegation of Sithra refugees, the last of their species, who had renounced the old worship and asked for asylum. Earth had granted it without hesitation. That was the legacy, Voss realized. Not an armada of terrifying warships, but the capacity to absorb betrayal and still choose compassion. It was the most dangerous and wonderful thing about being human. Far away, on the bridge of the Unbowed, Admiral Kine received a priority transmission from a deep space probe. The probe had detected a faint signal emanating from a dead galaxy cluster beyond the local group, a signal that matched the architect's frequency, but with a new modulation. A questioning note, as if something vast and old had just noticed that one of its dormant tools had been permanently dismantled and was now curious. Kine did not sound an alarm. She simply archived the data and added it to the growing file labeled Precursor Anomalies, Category 5. Then she ordered the fleet to battle-ready status and resumed patrol. Humanity had returned from the brink not to conquer, but to guard. And if the architects ever came looking for answers, they would find a species that had learned to weave its wounds into weapons, its grief into resolve, and its love into a shield that no dimensional predator could breach. The story would be told for millennia. How the Council betrayed Earth, how Earth was swallowed by silence, and how humanity returned with an armada, not to burn, but to build. The universe was listening now. And humanity was no longer a sacrifice, it was a promise.